أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغن عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين صدق الله العظيم.
I greet you all with the universal greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Kholofelo Molewa, and I am very honored to be able to give this Nasiha on this blessed day of Jummah. Over the last couple of months, we've been forced to reimagine our sense of space and time. The very worlds that we've come to occupy have narrowed in their physicality. Where those of us fortunate enough to have homes, our worlds have been limited to the brick parameters of the abodes that we occupy for the most part. It's been a strange time, bizarre even. And amidst the swirl of an initial pandemic, one which we still haven't quite figured out yet, we find ourselves living through another type of disease whose presence was reintroduced into our consciousness through the killing of a man whose last words in this dunya were to call out for his mother, who herself had been late for 2 years. It was harrowing to hear that, or to read that George Floyd's last words were call out his mother, and made more harrowing to learn later that his mother had passed away 2 years on. It's also been reported that George Floyd had tested for COVID-19. And here there's a strange irony that in some sense, here he was living out his last days through these twin pandemics effectively, both of which seemed to be competing for the very air that he breathed. In the initial weeks of the COVID pandemic in South Africa, there were more people who had been killed by state security forces than there were victims of the virus itself. I guess the most publicized victim, Collins Khosa, was killed by members of the South African Defence Force while sitting in his yard in Alexandra Township. The Khosa case and the state's reaction to it, sadly, is all too typical in our part of the world. So here we are, we've got these two men, oceans apart, lifetimes apart, and yet connected by histories, their respective histories that have often failed to place value on black life. There are differences, of course, and must be careful when we make such comparisons. Whereas in my view, in the US at least, race plays a more explicit role in the systemic killing and abuse of African American men and women and children. In South Africa, the threading of that narrative is slightly more complicated. Khosa was, after all, killed by other black men who in turn ultimately report to a black government. Simultaneously, though, and I say this without equivocation, it's impossible to imagine a white Collins Khosa sitting in his yard in Newlands, Cape Town, for instance, being assaulted and killed by the security forces. The cognitive dissonance would just be far too much. It's literally something that I couldn't get my head around. So, of course, in some sense, in a real sense, Khosa's blackness implicates him in his own death, much as George Floyd's blackness was central to his dying. In SA, though, class often seems to play a co-current role in determining the outcomes and the value of one's lived experience. Which is not to say that it's entirely different in the US, when there are overlaps. But in this country, race and class are often part of the same vicious Venn diagram in constantly correlated ways. But I think it would be fair to say that just because the superstructure in this country contains more black people within it does not in of itself sufficiently deracialize it. So we see the same patterns reproducing themselves that we see in the US when we speak of white supremacy. In Surah Al-Rum, chapter 30, verse 22, Allah the Most High proclaims, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Wa min ayatihi khalqu as-samawati wal ardu wa ikhtilafu al-sinatikum wa al-wanikum inna fi dhalika la ayatin lil alamin. Translation: and of the wondrous signs of Allah is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the variations and diversity in your languages, and in the pigmentation or colors of your skins. For in this there are messages for those who think and reflect. And so we must ask ourselves not only the question of how do we make it through this confusion, how do we pierce through the noise whilst pacing ourselves? We must ask ourselves also, how do we begin to live up to the ideals of this verse and others a lot like it, and the ideals that it captures? In my view, and I humbly submit, we should go further. We should ask, as human beings, as Muslims, what obligations does the current moment impose on us? What level of praxis is demanded of us as we attempt to distill the best possible ways forward? And by praxis, I really mean, what I really mean when I refer to praxis is how do we as a community meet the energy and the intent of these type of Quranic invocations? How do we literally live the word? Islam's foundational starting points are that of a community that pursues social order premised on a theological, ethical framework. Some modern scholars, such as Fazlur Rahman, who was based at the University of Chicago, describe the social order as being premised on the Quranic precepts of, on the one hand, Islam, peace, Iman, faith, and taqwa, God consciousness. In Rahman's articulation, Iman is rooted in the inner life of the believer, and whereas Islam is rooted in the outer surrender of the believer to God's law, with taqwa serving as the driving force of action. So the connector between what we say in words and what we reflect in our deeds. The praxis, as I'm articulating, I guess, in this context. One would argue that this ethical framework extends such an obligation beyond the individual, and in many instances centers the role of the community in forging a response to attaining social justice. The Holy Quran in Al-Imran chapter 3, verse 104, enjoins us to advocate righteousness as a community, and moreover, it enjoins us to actively forbid wrongs in our lives and within our community as a whole. And it reads as follows, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Wal takun minkum ummatun yada'unna illa al-khayri wa yamurunna bil ma'arfu wa yanhauna an munkari wa ulaika hummu al-muflihun. Translated, and let there be among you a community calling to virtue and advocating righteousness and deterring from evil. These are the successful. There is a type of exhortation in Islam that continuously speaks to a community-orientated praxis when it comes to issues of social justice. So when we speak of Black Lives Matter, we should consider quite carefully where and how we locate the weight of its meaning into our already, I guess, very noisy discourse. And here one wonders what the role of the Muslim community under apartheid says about how we could collectively respond to the current moment. Gideon Shimoni, in his book about the role of the South African Jewish community under apartheid, Community and Conscience, writes that South African Jews displayed a phenomenon of self-preservation performed at the cost of moral righteousness, thus absconding from what Shimoni describes as a liberal tradition going back hundreds of years. In this place, we've been speaking about race for the last 400 years, and I think the critique that Shimoni places within his own community is relatable to some aspects of the Muslims community's role even under apartheid. So I understand this sort of fatigue that comes with the circumstance of like constantly occupying the same moment and having the same conversations, like bad deja vu. So it's hard often to ward off indifference and nihilism, even within the midst of an intense crisis such as we find ourselves. In my view, we can't revert to, I guess, some of the usual talking points and gestures. It's not enough to simply post a black tile on our Instagram. We can't rely on sort of this reflexively citing one of the earliest Sahabas, Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, as a sort of definitive retort to any argument about racism in the community. So, like, we are not racism because Bilal was black, with and as the Quran describes him, with woolen hair and dark skin. That's we have to move beyond, I guess, those type of arguments and reflect them in our actual deeds on a day-to-day basis. Our response to state-sanctioned violence, both structural and physical, has to move from mere posturing to outright praxis, and do so in a way that places us as a community as part of the broader solution. And what I've come to know is that this community, at its best, can provide a shining example to society at large on how we can all build a praxis-oriented solidarity, one that resonates from the backyards of Alexandra townships to Minneapolis to Long Island, New York to Marikana. In fact, I'm of the Arundhatu Roy school of thought, who in a recent Financial Times piece argued that the worst possible outcome arising from this crisis would be a return to the normal we've just left behind. We need to radically reorder not only the conversations that we're having in our homes, in our masjids, on social media, but also in our actions. I see the current sets of events in the US in moral terms because I see racism as profoundly un-Islamic. I see it as a profoundly un-Islamic moral failing. Despite a sense of deja vu and fatigue, something about this current moment and conversation seems different. It feels like an inflection point, and perhaps I'm just expressing a hope here. But I think it's also a key opportunity for the community to reiterate some of, the best features of being Muslim in SA. The sense of community, certainly, the solidarity, an ingrained sense of charity, and empathy. And at the same time, it's also a good time to revisit areas where we've fallen short. So I guess my Nasiha in an advice is to encourage us to have these hard conversations about race and racism within the community, and in fact formalize some of our approaches to eradicating it. And that could include, I guess, a number of practical scenarios like formalizing teachings around race within the curriculum at madrasas, having a maybe top-down approach to addressing it from within the community, there's a number of ways in which we could organize around this and effectively enacting a very formal approach to uprooting racism within our community. I end my talk with the words of Frantz Fanon, who would have likely had no idea 50 years ago when he was writing this, and I quote, "When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt because for many reasons we can no longer breathe." May the Almighty guide and protect us. May Allah make us the helpers and protectors of the oppressed, and may Allah grant us all many more purpose-filled breaths in this lifetime. Inshallah. Ameen. Shukran.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the dispenser of grace. Ya Rabbal Alameen, O Lord of the universe, you created all human beings from the same essence and breathed of your spirit into each one of us. Help us to affirm the full dignity and honor of all human beings, no matter their skin colors. Ya Rabban Nas, O Lord of all humankind, we pray for all of those who have died at the hands of police and military personnel for no reason other than the color of their skin. Ya Rabb al-Qist, O Lord of compassionate justice, in our struggle to dismantle racism and the institutions and systems that keep racism alive, grant us the grace and strength to rid ourselves of the bias and hatred that oppress some of us while providing entitlement to others. Ya Rabb al-Quwwa, O Lord of power, help us to understand the ways we benefit from privilege and power so that we may be allies in the struggle for racial justice who are thoughtful and effective. We stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we pray for all who dedicate their lives to breaking down the race and class barriers in our communities. Ya Rabb as-Salam, O Lord of peace, you are the ultimate source of all peace and justice. We ask you to hear our prayers, to look with compassion on our world, and to unite us in bonds of love and solidarity. Nas'aluka bi asma'ika al-husna, and we ask this in all of your beautiful and holy names. Ya Rabban Nas, O Lord of all humankind, wa Rabbal Mustad'afin, and Lord of the oppressed and the marginalized. Allahumma Ameen.